You're listening to a CNA podcast.
US President Donald Trump started 2025 with his usual bluster. Is he engaged in a trade war with China? But by the end of the year, Mr. Trump had mostly backed down. Now, a key reason is China's dominance over rare earth minerals. In May last year, amid the tariff dispute between the two superpowers, China stopped exports of rare earth magnets to the United States. Within a week, American factories building everything from fighters and missiles to cars and electric motors ground to a halt. Europe experienced similar production shutdowns and delays. It was a reminder from Beijing to the world about its dependence on China's mining, processing, and export of rare earth elements. China has since suspended the export controls for a year after President Xi Jinping and Trump reached a trade agreement on the sidelines of the 2025 APEC summit in South Korea. But Beijing could resume its ban anytime if trade negotiations go south. A fact not lost on the U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who views this as China's strategic use of its dominance in rare earths.
Make no mistake. This is China versus the world. They have put these unacceptable export controls on the entire world.
Despite the name, rare earth minerals aren't actually rare. There are significant deposits in places like Australia, India, Vietnam, Russia, Brazil, and the US. It was actually the US that allowed China to take over the entire industry. So how did we get here in the first place? I'm Arnold Gay. Welcome to the CNA Correspondent podcast. I'm joined today by producer Pearl Forss and senior correspondent Leong Waikit. Waikit, good to see you again. Pearl, first time we're chatting, but great to have you on the show. Let's have a little bit of a history lesson to start with, Pearl. How did the US let China dominate the rare earths market in the first place? I mean, right now we hear China this, China there, whenever we talk about rare earths.
Yeah, if you look into history, it's interesting that the US, with its Mountain Pass mine in California, was actually the largest producer of rare earths in the world back in the 1950s to 1980s. But then what we saw was that environmental consciousness grew, and there were protests around the pollution at the rare earth mines. So it was difficult to expand the Mountain Pass mine and also to open new mines. At the same time, China was determined to grow its rare earth capabilities. Deng Xiaoping famously said in 1992 that the Middle East has oil and China has rare earth. And you know what? When Deng Xiaoping died, that mission was passed to a geologist named Wen Jiabao, who had a master's degree in rare earths, and we know he became China's premier. So you can imagine the amount of state attention that went into building the rare earth industry in China. So what we saw on the one hand was US and Europe shutting down rare earth mines due to pollution. On the other hand, China investing heavily into rare earths for its global vision of becoming a leader in the field. So for both these reasons, you end up with the situation today of China dominating over 90% of rare earth exports in the world.
Okay, so here we are, Waikit. I don't want to go into specifics quite yet, but it's been decades in the making, as Pearl just pointed out. Very briefly, what were Southeast Asian countries doing all this time? I mean, Mountain Pass opened in 1952. That's a very long time ago. Were they blind to what China was doing, or did they actually look into it and decide, maybe we don't really want to do this?
Southeast Asian countries didn't immediately rush in to fill in the gap because back then, most countries didn't have the capacity to do so, and their policy focus also wasn't primarily on rare earths. Countries like Malaysia, and we'll talk about Malaysia in just a while, but countries like Malaysia was also quite cautious because in the late, or rather early 90s, it closed down one of its rare earth mining sites because there were protests and concerns that the radioactive waste produced from rare earth mining can cause birth defects. And even in Myanmar, which I cover, it has boomed in the last 5 years, rare earth mining, but it was very sluggish. It only picked up pace around 2020. In 2011, during then President Thein Sein's time, there was some effort to assess the rare earth mining sites in the country, but that didn't pick up any momentum. So to answer your question, most countries back then in Southeast Asia didn't rush in immediately.
Let's get back to the present, Pearl. Experts say that there are enough rare earth deposits around the world. So if the world can get past environmental concerns, what's stopping them from just saying, look, let's go mine, these elements and reduce our dependence on China?
Digging them up is not so hard, it's just digging, but the key is refining it. And here's what Associate Professor Marina Chang from the University of Technology, Sydney, told us.
There are enough deposits in the world that can supply rare earths, but I'll quote Elon Musk. He once said, whoever controls the deposits or the mines of those rare earths actually are not important. The critical point is who controls the processing technologies.
A Chinese expert put it to me this way. It's like digging up a whole mountain and the rare earth in there is a small percentage of all that soil and rock. Maybe just a few kilograms. And how are you going to separate out the material? There's technology behind that. And most of the patents around that technology is being held by China. Dr. Marina Zhang, that we heard from earlier, said that China is the only country in the world that has developed the capacity to cover the entire value chain of all the 17 rare earth elements. And going back to what you raised, Arnold, about rare earth and the environment, we know that it's so pollutive to dig up so much land for that tiny bit of rare earth. And the refining process involves heavy chemicals, a process called leaching that destroys surrounding agriculture. Most countries don't find that it is worth their while to do this when they can actually buy it for a reasonable price from China.
Okay, you've explained the global dependence. There is one exception that we know of. Japan, I guess, did a few things to reduce its reliance on China. Not what you would expect, right, from a country that builds so many cars, machinery, precision, medical and optical equipment. So what happened? How did Tokyo do it? I imagine it isn't just, an issue of pouring money into the problem, right? Because that means that the US can easily do the same.
What happened? Well, they were forced to do it. Most countries, as you pointed out, have an over 90% dependence on Chinese rare earth minerals. Japan is the only country that brought that number down to 50% over the last 15 years. And it all goes back to the year 2010, when a Chinese fishing boat collided with a Japanese Coast Guard vessel off the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands in the East China Sea, which is an area of dispute for the two countries. Japan arrested the captain of the boat. Protests erupted in China. China stopped rare earth exports to Japan and Japanese industry got frozen. Not so different from what happened in the USA last year when some of Ford's car production lines came to a total stop when China stopped rare earth exports. So what happened then? Japan panicked and pumped over $1 billion into diversifying their rare earth supply in the year 2010 and the years after. They went around the world to Kazakhstan, Mongolia, Australia, Africa to look for rare earth mines. They built huge rare earth recycling facilities within Japan, and they engineered new technologies, new magnets that required less rare earth. It was a whole of government, whole of industry approach to solving this problem.
I want to ask about a particular name that also comes up as part of Japan's effort. Successful? Well, we'll talk about that in a bit, whether or not it was 100% successful. But Linus was apparently, a key component in Japan's efforts that you just outlined, Pearl. But White Kid, I want to ask you, this is a company, an Australian company, that set up operations in Malaysia, where I believe it has a refining facility right now. So kind of take us through its particular role and what sort of a future role is it going to have in terms of this quest for rare earth supply chain diversity?
This Linus plant you talked about, Arnold, was established in Malaysia in 2012. Fast forward to right now, and kudos to Pearl's team for the documentary. You will now appreciate that Malaysia is the second largest provider of refined rare earths. Malaysia is also internally pushed for that. It has come up with national policies to boost domestic processing. And of course, it wants to do more. It wants to explore rare earth elements as a new resource for the country. And that means not just mining rare earth, but also making rare earth magnets. Now, to do that, you need to build an ecosystem. Karim Kasim is an analyst in Malaysia, and one of his research interests includes geoeconomics of critical minerals. Take a listen to what Karim Kasim said.
Right now, the ecosystem is still building, it's still nascent, but in some sense, because of Linus, Malaysia has a head start in building that ecosystem, particularly around the chemicals industry. Because to refine it, you need a lot of chemical input, and a lot of it does come from Malaysia. Malaysia does have a very capable chemical sector.
So, of course, there's a lot of incentive for Malaysia to do this. Economically, it can contribute to GDP, it can create jobs. And from a geopolitical strategic viewpoint, Malaysia can also position itself as a middle ground country. It tried to play a role to mediate between Cambodia and Thailand, and also was able to attract many world leaders to Kuala Lumpur during the ASEAN summit. And it has taken effort to get the bloc to diversify its economic partners, organizing your China GCC summits and all that. And when Trump visited Kuala Lumpur, they signed some rare earth mineral deals. And right now, there's also talk between Putrajaya and Beijing in that China could possibly share expertise with Malaysia in a bid to secure the rare earth supplies in Malaysia.
I want to press you a little bit more about ASEAN's role, because you mentioned what happened at the summit last year. We know China has mines, but it also relies on Southeast Asian countries like Laos, Cambodia, but in particular Myanmar for heavy rare earth ores. And we know Linus doesn't have much of this either in Malaysia or in Australia. So can you help us understand how significant these suppliers are in the global supply chain for rare earth minerals?
Right. For Laos and Cambodia, I think we can see it as China's way to diversify the import of rare earth material, but they're not major suppliers like Myanmar. Why is Myanmar so significant? For a few reasons. Geologically, parts of Myanmar is home to some of the heavy rare earth sites in Kachin State, in Shan State, and geographically, it's of course very close to China. It shares borders, so the proximity and also the cheap labor there makes it attractive as a market for China. And domestically, there are certain reasons that also give rise to why it boomed so quickly, right? There's lack of regulation. Like I said earlier, back in 2011, there was some attempt to sort of put the industry together, but that didn't take off. And right now, of course, we know that there's this Myanmar crisis going on. And so these conditions make it very ripe for illegal mining to take place, right? And there's also not a lot of concern about your environmental friendliness. But of course, for China to look to Myanmar, there are risks. The supplies will not always be stable because conflict is ongoing. The control of rare earth mines doesn't come from the central government. Back then in 2011, it didn't come from Wu Ting-seng's time. It also didn't come from the junta. It comes down to who controls those areas. And right now, it is controlled by one of the ethnic armies called KIA, which stands for Kachin Independence Army. So they've also been accused of exploiting the situation, right? They sell these rare earths to China, and they've been accused of using the funds to fight the junta. But at the same time, they are also working with Chinese firms or Chinese-backed firms in that it gives them protection, it leases them licenses, and also gives them security.
Paul, we don't talk about lessons until we have a crisis. I think we have a crisis now. So I'm wondering, what sort of lessons are there? I mean, first of all, for Asia, the Americans, and for the Europeans. I think you talked about a sustained all-party effort, including the government and private sectors.
Okay, there are several components to your story, and I think the lesson to be learned for Asian countries is very different to the lessons that needs to be learned by US, Europe, and Japan. So let's talk about Asian countries first, right? China has said that they are open to working with the Global South countries to share their rare earth expertise. So for Asian countries, they can collaborate with Chinese companies to start up their own rare earth industries, see what the best practices are in terms of managing pollution, and push on to expand this important industry, but carefully and responsibly drawing on China's experience of the last 3-4 decades. And here in Southeast Asia, we've seen Malaysia, Vietnam making concrete plans to grow their rare earth industries, as Waikit pointed out earlier. But when it comes to the US and Europe, it's a different story. They are focused on de-risking from China. So I think that they can draw from the Japan experience. And here's the advice from Kazuto Suzuki, director of the Institute of Geoeconomics in Japan, on the lessons for the West.
Do everything you can. I mean, recycling, investing in other countries, creating a refinery in, much lower cost countries, or building a stockpile, trying to find alternatives just in case, and try to make it cheaper. We have done everything we can, and we reduce but we still depend 50% to China. We initially started from 90%, over 90%, so we are reducing half of the dependency, but still we are dependent on China because that is more economically reasonable.
So as we heard from him, the key lessons are to invest in mines at home and overseas, collaborate internationally with partners like Australia, who's going to be playing a very important role in global rare earth manufacturing. And governments need to support these investments with taxpayers' dollars, because the investment is just too large to expect the private sector to be able to shoulder it all. But most of all, the West needs to find a way to work with China because they need rare earths. And it's just so hard to grow this industry because of the environmental problems around it. Japan tried for 15 years to do it, and they are still 50% dependent on China for their rare earths. So China took over 3 decades to build the rare earth industry since the time of Deng Xiaoping. It's hard to imagine that the US can do it in the space of one Trump administration.
Pearl, is it possible to, turn away a little bit from supply chains? I mean, is there innovation, is there technology available that's being looked at that will, allow you to make these powerful magnets, for example, without the use of rare earths?
Certainly, and Japan has been trying to do it. All the major companies in Japan, Honda, Toshiba, Daido Steels, they've been trying to engineer these magnets for the last 15 years. And there has been some results, but the point is that they're very, very expensive. So, it just makes more economic sense to continue to buy those rare earths from China. And I'm pretty sure right now engineers in the US and Europe, especially those in the military industries, are trying to see if they can engineer alternatives. But R&D is a long process. It's not something that happens overnight.
All right. Waikit, just want to quickly talk to you a little bit about what's happening in terms of the environmental impact of all the mining that's taking place in Southeast Asia. A lot less regulation, a lot less laws here with regard to this particular issue. Can you sort of take us through the downstream consequences of people who live in the wider Mekong Basin? They depend on the basin for their livelihoods, but there's also a significant amount of exports that go elsewhere, for example, like seafood.
Right. Pearl talked about the process of rare earth mining, that's leaching. So basically that's injecting solution into the ground so that you can dissolve and then later on collect the rare earth minerals that you need. The concern is that there will be contamination, right? And if it's not handled well, you can imagine it will flow to rivers, affect lives, affect marine lives. And then one of the other concerns, of course, is deforestation from clearing of trees for mining, right? Of course, that gives rise to the risk of landslide. Now let's focus a little bit more on Malaysia. Earlier, I talked about in the late 80s, early 90s, there were protests and concerns of birth defects because of the radioactive materials that arose from rare earth mining. But if you watch Pearl's documentary, and they've been on the ground, they spoke to people near the Linus plant. The team that spoke to them say the river waters near the plant, some 5 kilometers away from the plant, they are regularly tested, and it's deemed safe. Local fishermen who fish clams, for instance, they say that clams are still good. right? If you move to Myanmar, there it's now in conflict, very hard to regulate certain things. Pearl's team spoke to some Myanmar journalists there who interviewed people who worked in the rare earth mining sites. And they talked about how the contaminated waters, when they come in contact with them, gave them rashes, there was swelling, and they described the contaminated waters as black, and you cannot eat the fish there. But let me quickly talk about mitigating factors here. It's not rare earth pollution driven per se, but there's mechanisms such as your LMC, which is the Lanchang Mekong mechanism. It's led by China. So they don't specifically discuss pollution or contamination as a result of rare earth, but that platform allows your Mekong countries like your Thailand, Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos to raise concerns. So you can talk about water resources cooperation, you can work on green development projects, and even align your policies such that you can minimize damage caused by rare earth mining.
Paul, just want to ask you a bit of a geopolitical question, although you can say this entire conversation was geopolitical. There are experts who say China right now is playing a very delicate game, using rare earth supply as a possible tool of coercion. Is there consensus at all that such efforts, such restrictions could backfire for Beijing?
Before I answer your question, I really just want to go back to a point that Waikit made about the environmental impact of rare earth mining. When we were doing the documentary, working with Myanmar activists and producers in Thailand last year, one thing that really stood out for me was these horrific pictures of fishes in the Mekong River that the fishermen had found in the last few months. These fishes had blisters all over them, and really looked quite monstrous, to say the least. And when we spoke to rice farmers in Thailand, so we're not even talking about Myanmar here, because Thailand is downriver from Myanmar, they no longer could use water from the rivers for their agriculture activities because they had tested these waters and found that the level of pollution in them, likely a result of these rare earth mining, was too high. So I think that we have a real problem with food safety issues on our hands as a result of rare earth mining in Myanmar, and I really do hope that regional governments look into this. But okay, now we go back to that point about China and geopolitics and this game. Well, the view from China is that it was Trump, right, who started playing this delicate game with his tariffs, and they were forced to use the rare earth card. And of course, from the Chinese side, they know that doing so will make other countries step up efforts to develop the rare earth industry. So yes, there's a possibility that the restrictions could backfire, but I want to go back to the Japan case again. It's telling. If even a country like Japan cannot eliminate its reliance on Chinese rare earths after 15 years of trying, then will Europe and the USA be able to challenge Chinese monopoly within the next few years? I put this question to Thomas Krumer. He is a rare earth minerals specialist, and this is what he told me.
How long do you think it's going to take the world to wean itself off China rare earth minerals and magnets?
Never. It's not possible. China has built up a capacity, particularly in rare earth permanent magnets, which is huge. We can come up with crude solutions for several products, for several applications, but the whole range of dozens of different products, of different purities and all that, very difficult.
You can watch Pearl's full documentary, When Titans Clash, The Race for Rare Earths, on CNA Insider. Pearl and Waikit, thank you so much for talking to me on the show today. I'm Arnold Gay, and this CNA Correspondent podcast was brought to you by Clara Ong, Tiffany Ang, Nat Fetelvero, and Craig Dale. See you next time.